It was always the same time, 10:32 p.m. The streetlights would dim, flicker twice, and then fall into an unsettling silence. Pine Hollow was a quiet town, one of those places where everyone knew each other, and any disturbance was immediately written off as some minor inconvenience. Probably a wiring issue, the townsfolk would say. These things happened. But not everyone was so quick to dismiss the flickering lights. Mrs. Hargrove, the town's oldest resident, had a different theory. Each time the lights flickered, she would stand in her window, peering out through the sheer curtains, muttering to herself. "Another one's gone," she'd say softly, her voice thin with age. Most people thought she was losing her mind. "Old folks get strange ideas," they whispered. Lila Foster, a young woman with a sharp curiosity, had lived in Pine Hollow her entire life. She worked at the local diner, where the scent of burnt coffee clung to her clothes, and the regulars sat in the same seats every day. Lila, though, felt suffocated by the town's predictability. She had always craved something more, something different from the monotony that hung over Pine Hollow like a fog. And so, when Mrs. Hargrove's peculiar mutterings about the lights and the disappearances reached Lila's ears, her interest was piqued. Lila had grown up hearing the stories of people leaving town unexpectedly, but she had never given them much thought. People left all the time, moved away, started new lives, sometimes without saying a word. But Mrs. Hargrove's conviction that the flickering lights were somehow connected to the disappearances began to gnaw at Lila's thoughts. The timing was always suspicious. A light would flicker, and the next day someone would be gone without a trace, as if they had vanished into thin air. One rainy evening, Lila decided to visit Mrs. Hargrove. The old woman lived at the edge of town, in a small, decrepit house that seemed to sag under the weight of its own history. Lila hesitated at the front door, her hand poised to knock. The air around her felt thick, like it was holding its breath. Finally, she knocked. The door creaked open almost immediately, as if Mrs. Hargrove had been waiting for her. The old woman's eyes were sharp, piercing through Lila with an intensity that made her want to shrink back. "You're here about the lights," Mrs. Hargrove said, her voice a brittle whisper. Lila nodded, her throat suddenly dry. "Yes. I've heard the stories. You think the lights are connected to the disappearances, don't you?" Mrs. Hargrove stepped aside, gesturing for Lila to enter. The house smelled of dust and old wood, and the walls were lined with faded photographs. Lila felt a shiver crawl up her spine. "I don't think it," Mrs. Hargrove said, leading Lila to a small sitting room. "I know it." The room was dim, lit only by a single flickering lamp. Mrs. Hargrove sat down in an armchair that looked as old as she was, her bony hands clasped tightly together. "They don't just leave, you know. They're taken. And the lights are a warning." Lila leaned forward, her heart pounding. "Taken by who? Or what?" Mrs. Hargrove's lips thinned into a grim line. "The town. The town itself. Pine Hollow isn't like other places. It's alive, in a way. And it demands something from us." Lila's skin prickled with unease. "What does it demand?" "People," Mrs. Hargrove whispered. "It needs people. Every few years, it takes someone. And the lights, the flickering, they're how it tells us." Lila felt a coldness seep into her bones. This couldn't be real. It was too far-fetched, too impossible. But as she looked into Mrs. Hargrove's eyes, she realized the old woman believed every word she was saying. "The lights are going to flicker again tonight," Mrs. Hargrove continued, her voice low. "And when they do, someone else will disappear." Lila stood, her heart racing. "I don't believe you," she said, though doubt was already creeping into her mind. Mrs. Hargrove smiled, a sad, knowing smile. You will. Lila left the house quickly, the cold night air biting at her skin. She hurried down the empty street, her footsteps echoing in the stillness. The lights above her began to flicker. The street felt unnaturally quiet as Lila hurried away from Mrs. Hargrove's house, her footsteps tapping against the wet pavement. The flickering lights overhead seemed to pulse in rhythm with her growing unease. She couldn't shake Mrs. Hargrove's words from her mind. The town is alive. It needs people. The thought lodged itself in her brain like a splinter, too strange to be true, yet too unnerving to dismiss. Lila reached the center of town, where the streetlights bathed everything in a faint, flickering glow. The diner's neon sign buzzed weakly, and the usual group of regulars were gathered inside, sipping their coffee, unaware of the quiet dread Lila carried with her. She hesitated outside, watching them through the window. For a moment, she considered going inside, sitting at the counter, and letting the hum of small-town chatter drown out the unsettling conversation she just had. But something stopped her. It was the flickering, again, soft and slow, like a warning whisper just out of earshot. Lila had grown up under these lights, never giving them a second thought. They were just part of the landscape, reliable, unremarkable. But now, each flicker felt like a cold hand brushing against her skin. She could feel the town watching her, though no one else seemed to notice. She turned away from the diner and headed toward the park at the edge of town, where the lights didn't reach. As she walked, she tried to convince herself that Mrs. Hargrove's story was just that, a story. A lonely old woman's way of making sense of the random disappearances that every town had. People moved, they started new lives elsewhere. Pine Hollow wasn't special. It wasn't cursed. It was just ordinary. But as she neared the park, the ordinary began to feel thin, like a veneer that was wearing away. The trees loomed over her, their branches casting long, skeletal shadows. The park was deserted, as it always was at this hour, the swings hanging still and lifeless. Lila stood on the path, staring into the darkness, waiting. She didn't know what she was waiting for, proof, maybe. Or reassurance that Mrs. Hargrove was wrong. The lights flickered again. This time, it wasn't a simple dimming. The streetlights blinked off completely for a full second, plunging Lila into darkness. When they flickered back on, she felt her breath catch in her throat. There, just at the edge of the light, she saw something. A shape, human, but not quite. It stood motionless, just beyond the reach of the streetlights, as if the darkness itself had formed a figure. Lila froze, her pulse quickening. The figure didn't move, but she could feel it watching her, its presence pressing against her skin like a weight. She wanted to look away, to run, but her legs felt heavy, rooted to the ground. The lights flickered again, and for a moment, the figure seemed to blur, to dissolve into the shadows before reforming as the lights steadied once more. And then, in a blink, it was gone. Lila stood there, her heart racing, her breath coming in short gasps. She scanned the park, but there was nothing. No movement, no sign that anyone, or anything, had been there. But she had seen it. She was sure of it. It wasn't her imagination. She turned and walked quickly back toward town, her mind racing. The figure had been real. She didn't know what it was or how it was connected to the lights, but it had been there, watching her. And if Mrs. Hargrove was right, it wouldn't be the last time. As Lila reached the main road, she felt a chill run down her spine. The lights here were steady now, no more flickering. But the unease lingered, as if something had shifted in the air. She glanced back over her shoulder, half expecting to see the figure standing at the edge of the park again. But the street was empty. She needed answers. and there was only one place left to get them. Mrs. Hargrove had spoken of the town like it was alive, like it had its own desires. If that was true, then Pine Hollow was hiding something it didn't want anyone to know. Lila's thoughts drifted back to the disappearances, people who had simply vanished without a trace, as if the town had swallowed them whole. She wasn't sure where to start, but she knew she couldn't stop now. The town was hiding something, and if the lights were part of it, then she was going to find out what. As she neared her small apartment on the outskirts of town, the streetlights flickered again, casting brief, shadowy patterns across the pavement. Lila shivered, pulling her jacket tighter around her. The town was waiting, watching. Lila couldn't shake the feeling that she was being followed. The flickering streetlights outside her apartment cast long, distorted shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally far. Her keys jangled in her hand as she fumbled with the lock, her fingers trembling despite the cold. The door creaked open, and she stepped inside, closing it quickly behind her as if that simple motion could lock out whatever was lurking in the night. The apartment was quiet, as it always was. The soft ticking of the old clock on the wall was the only sound to break the stillness. Lila stood in the center of the room, listening to her own breathing, the echoes of her footsteps fading into the silence. It was too quiet. She could almost hear the weight of the town pressing against her windows, like it was holding its breath, waiting for her next move. She moved to the small kitchen and poured herself a glass of water, her hands shaking slightly as she lifted it to her lips. The conversation with Mrs. Hargrove replayed in her mind, the old woman's voice brittle and thin, yet strangely authoritative. It needs people. The town takes what it needs. Lila had wanted to dismiss it as nonsense, but after what she'd seen in the park, she wasn't so sure anymore. She thought about the figure, dark and shapeless, standing just at the edge of the light, watching her. It hadn't moved. It hadn't threatened her. But its presence had been enough to send a chill through her bones. She could still feel it, that sense of being observed, of something lurking just beyond the visible world. The clock ticked on. Lila sank onto the worn couch, staring out the window at the flickering lights in the distance. The rhythmic blinking felt almost deliberate, like a signal she didn't yet understand. It was as if the town itself was trying to communicate with her, sending out coded warnings that only she could decipher. The lights had always flickered, but now she noticed their subtle pattern, the way they seemed to blink at precise intervals, almost like a pulse. As the night deepened, the flickers grew more erratic. Lila watched them, transfixed, until the pattern suddenly stopped. For a few seconds, the lights were steady again, unwavering in their glow. Then they blinked once, twice, and went out completely. Darkness swallowed the street outside. Her apartment, illuminated only by the faint glow of her bedside lamp, felt suddenly smaller, as though the walls were closing in. Lila stood up slowly, her body tense, and moved to the window. She peered out into the blackness, but there was nothing to see, no lights, no figures, just an inky void that seemed to go on forever. And then, faintly, she heard it. A sound like a distant hum, low and resonant, carried through the night. At first, she thought it was her imagination, but as she strained to listen, it grew louder, like the murmur of voices far away. They were indistinct, too far to make out words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a chant, a soft, rhythmic cadence, rising and falling with the flickers of the street lights. Lila's heart pounded in her chest. She backed away from the window, suddenly feeling exposed, vulnerable. The air in the apartment seemed to thicken, pressing against her skin. The hum persisted, growing louder now, as if the entire town had joined in a silent, unseen ritual. She grabbed her phone, her fingers shaking as she dialed the number she hadn't called in years. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered, groggy and confused. "Lila? It's late. What's going on?" "Mom," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "There's something wrong with the town." There was a pause on the other end, and for a moment, Lila thought the line had gone dead. But then her mother's voice returned, low and hesitant. "Lila, you're not still thinking about those old stories, are you? The ones your grandmother used to tell? It's not just stories, Mom. It's happening. The lights, there's something wrong with them. People are disappearing." Another long pause, filled only by the faint hum that still echoed in Lila's ears. When her mother finally spoke again, her voice was softer, almost resigned. "I told you to stay away from that town." The words hit Lila like a blow, the finality of them settling deep into her bones. She had grown up here, in Pine Hollow. She had always thought of it as home. But now, standing in her darkened apartment, the truth began to unfold in her mind like a series of slow, inevitable realizations. The lights weren't just malfunctioning. They weren't just a harmless technical glitch. They were a warning, a signal, something the town had been trying to hide. And now, whatever it was waking up. Lila lowered the phone, her pulse racing, her mind spinning. She couldn't stay here. Not tonight. She needed answers, and the only person who might have them was Mrs. Hargrove. If there was more to the town's dark history, she needed to know, even if it meant facing whatever waited for her in the shadows. As she grabbed her coat and headed for the door, the lights flickered back to life, casting long, eerie shadows across the empty street. The hum faded, replaced by the steady buzz of electricity. But the feeling didn't leave. The town was still watching. And this time, it wasn't going to let her go so easily. The road leading to Mrs. Hargrove's house was darker than Lila remembered. Each street lamp flickered as she passed, casting brief bursts of light that seemed to distort the familiar path into something foreign, almost hostile. The quiet had an unnatural weight to it, as if the very air was thick with secrets and shadows. Lila's footsteps echoed in the silence, an intruder in a world that had already moved beyond her. Mrs. Hargrove's house stood at the end of the road, a squat, old structure with windows that seemed too small for its frame. The front door was slightly ajar, a sliver of dim light spilling onto the porch, as though the house was expecting her. For a moment, Lila hesitated. The thought of turning back crossed her mind, but something stronger, a pull she couldn't explain, drew her forward. There was no going back now. The answers she sought were inside. She stepped onto the porch, the wood creaking under her weight, and pushed the door open with a slow, hesitant hand. The scent of old paper and dust greeted her, mingling with the faint smell of something earthy, like damp leaves. The house was dimly lit, the few lamps casting long, indistinct shadows that seemed to cling to the walls. "Mrs. Hargrove?" Lila called, her voice tentative, breaking the stillness. There was no immediate answer, just the faint rustling sound coming from deeper within the house. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her, the latch clicking shut with a finality that sent a shiver down her spine. The sound of her footsteps on the worn wooden floor felt intrusive, a reminder that she was walking into something she shouldn't. In the parlor, Mrs. Hargrove sat in her usual chair, the flickering light from a small lamp illuminating her pale face. She didn't look surprised to see Lila. In fact, she seemed almost expectant, as if she had known all along that Lila would return. "You came," Mrs. Hargrove said softly, her voice barely more than a whisper. Her eyes, sharp and dark, studied Lila with an intensity that made her feel exposed, vulnerable. Lila nodded, swallowing hard. "I need to know what's happening," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "The lights, the disappearances, what's causing it?" Mrs. Hargrove's expression didn't change. She leaned forward slightly, her thin hands resting in her lap. I told you before, Lila. The town takes what it needs. But why? Lila's voice rose with frustration. Why now? Why me? For the first time, Mrs. Hargrove smiled, a small, tight curve of her lips that didn't reach her eyes. It's always been this way. Pine Hollow has its traditions. But you see, most people don't notice. They don't question. The lights flicker, and they forget. But not you. You've always been different, haven't you? Lila's breath caught in her throat. The room felt suddenly smaller, the walls pressing in. She had always felt a disconnect from Pine Hollow, even as a child. She had left as soon as she could, never fully understanding why she felt compelled to escape. Now, the pieces were falling into place, and she wasn't sure she liked the picture they were forming. I don't understand, she whispered, more to herself than to Mrs. Hargrove. What does this have to do with me? Mrs. Hargrove's gaze remained fixed on her, unwavering. You're part of this town, whether you like it or not. And Pine Hollow has a way of calling its own back when the time is right. Lila felt a coldness settle over her, sinking deep into her bones. What does it want? Mrs. Hargrove didn't answer immediately. Instead, she rose slowly from her chair, her movements deliberate, as though every action carried a weight of meaning. She walked to the small window at the front of the room, pulling back the lace curtain just enough to peer outside. The lights are its way of reaching out, she said finally, her voice soft and distant. A signal, if you will. When they flicker, it means the town is hungry. Lila's stomach churned at the word, her mouth suddenly dry. Hungry for what? Mrs. Hargrove turned to face her, her eyes dark and unreadable. For us, child. For what we carry inside of us. The room seemed to tilt around Lila, the air thickening with a suffocating dread. She took a step back, her mind racing, trying to make sense of what Mrs. Hargrove was saying. The flickering lights, the disappearances, they weren't accidents or coincidences. The town was feeding off its people, one by one. It's not too late, Mrs. Hargrove said quietly, watching Lila closely. You can still leave, if you're quick. But if you stay... She let the sentence hang in the air, the unfinished thought more terrifying than any words could convey. Lila's heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to run, to flee the house and the town and never look back. But something rooted her to the spot, something stronger than fear. She had to know the truth, even if it destroyed her. What happens if I stay? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Hargrove's expression softened, almost pitying. You'll become part of Pine Hollow's story. And it won't let you go. A chill ran down Lila's spine as the words settled over her like a shroud. She glanced out the window, the lights outside flickering in the distance, blinking like silent sentinels. The hum she had heard earlier was faint but still present, a low, insistent vibration in the air. She could feel it now, the pull of the town, the way it seemed to draw her in, deeper into its secrets, its darkness. And she realized with a sickening certainty that she wasn't going to leave. Pine Hollow had already claimed her. Lila returned home that evening, though she couldn't quite explain why. The conversation with Mrs. Hargrove lingered in her mind like the remnants of a bad dream. The old woman's words gnawed at her, unsettling but vague, leaving her with a sense of inevitability she didn't want to acknowledge. As she stepped into her small apartment, the light above her head flickered. A tremor of unease ran through her, and she paused, staring at the bulb as it sputtered and dimmed before glowing steadily again. It felt as though the town itself was watching her, its presence slipping through the cracks of her life, insistent and unshakable. The room was too quiet, as if the very air had stilled in anticipation of something yet to come. Lila sat at the edge of her bed, running her hands over her knees, trying to shake the creeping sense of dread that had followed her home. She thought about leaving, packing up and disappearing before the town could tighten its grip around her. But she knew, deep down, that it wasn't that simple. She had stayed too long. Pine Hollow had already woven her into its fabric. As the evening darkened, Lila found herself drawn to the window. Outside, the streetlights flickered in their familiar rhythm, casting the same eerie glow she had grown accustomed to over the past few days. The town lay quiet beneath them, still and waiting. She watched the lights blink on and off, trying to spot some pattern, something that would explain their strange behavior. The regular pulse was hypnotic, lulling her into a strange calm despite the fear that coiled within her. But just as she began to settle, the lights flickered again, only this time, it wasn't the same steady pulse. They stuttered, erratically, as if something had disrupted their cycle. And then, just for a second, the world outside her window plunged into complete darkness. Lila's breath caught in her throat. She pressed her hands to the glass, her heart racing. In the brief blackout, the town felt different, emptier somehow, as though the darkness had swallowed more than just the light. When the street lamps flared back on, the familiar shapes of houses and trees seemed somehow altered. She blinked, telling herself it was her imagination, but a low hum, barely audible, filled the air again, that same frequency she had heard the night before. It wasn't just in her head. It was out there everywhere, seeping through the town like an unseen force, vibrating against the walls of her apartment. Lila pulled back from the window, her pulse quickening. The unease she had been feeling all day blossomed into full-blown terror. She couldn't deny it any longer. There was something wrong with Pine Hollow. The disappearances, the flickering lights, the strange hum, they were all connected, part of some dark pattern that she was only beginning to comprehend. Mrs. Hargrove's voice echoed in her mind. The town takes what it needs. She didn't want to believe it, but the signs were there, closing in around her. Pine Hollow was alive, in a way that defied understanding. It was as though the town itself had a will, a hunger that demanded to be fed. Her phone buzzed suddenly, breaking the silence. Lila jumped, fumbling for it with trembling hands. A message flashed across the screen, a name she hadn't seen in years. Rachel. Her heart skipped a beat. Rachel had been her best friend in high school, the one person who had understood Lila's desperate need to leave Pine Hollow. They had drifted apart after graduation, their lives pulling them in different directions. Why would Rachel be texting her now? She opened the message, her eyes scanning the brief text. Do you hear it too? Lila stared at the screen, her skin prickling. She didn't need to ask what Rachel meant. The hum, that strange vibration she couldn't escape, Rachel had heard it too. But what did it mean? Before she could respond, a second message appeared. Meet me. Same place as before. The words sent a shiver through her. The same place, she knew exactly where Rachel meant. The old train station on the outskirts of town, abandoned for years, where they had spent countless summer nights as teenagers, sharing secrets and talking about their dreams of leaving Pine Hollow behind. But something about the message felt off. The timing was too strange, too perfect. Had Rachel been experiencing the same things as Lila? The flickering lights, the growing sense of dread? Or was this just another part of the town's twisted game? She hesitated for a moment, considering her options. She could ignore the message, stay inside, and hope that whatever was happening would pass. Or she could go to the station and face whatever awaited her there. Lila glanced out the window once more. The lights continued to flicker, their irregular dance casting fleeting shadows across the empty streets. The hum had grown louder, a steady, insistent thrum that pressed against her skull, as though urging her to make a choice. With a deep breath, Lila grabbed her jacket and headed for the door. The fear still clung to her, thick and suffocating, but beneath it was a flicker of something else, curiosity. Whatever was happening in Pine Hollow, it was leading her somewhere. And she had to know where. As she stepped out into the night, the door closing softly behind her, the streetlights dimmed once again, casting the town in a brief, unsettling darkness. The path to the old train station was one Lila knew well, but tonight, it felt different, foreign, somehow. The air was cooler, heavy with a stillness that pressed down on her as she walked, her footsteps muffled by the damp ground. Pine Hollow had always felt quiet after dark, but tonight, it was more than just quiet, it was expectant. The train station loomed ahead, a hulking shape barely visible under the flickering streetlights. It had been abandoned for years, forgotten by most of the town, left to rot in the shadow of the more respectable areas. Lila and Rachel used to sneak here as teenagers, drawn to its isolation, its sense of being outside the bounds of Pine Hollow's suffocating gaze. Now, the station seemed to watch her approach, its empty windows like eyes. Lila hesitated at the entrance. The same low hum that had plagued her in recent days buzzed faintly in the background, almost indistinguishable from the wind. It felt stronger here, like the ground itself was vibrating beneath her feet. She pushed open the door, its hinges creaking, and stepped inside. The station was just as she remembered, dark, damp, and eerily silent. The large, empty room stretched before her, filled with the remnants of old benches and ticket counters, all swallowed by shadows. She peered into the dimness, searching for Rachel, but there was no sign of her. "Rachel?" Lila's voice echoed, hollow and uncertain. No response. Just the hum, growing louder now, its steady pulse filling the room. Lila took a few cautious steps forward, her eyes scanning the shadows. And then she saw it, a faint glow, coming from the far corner of the station. It flickered like the streetlights outside, pulsing in time with the hum. She moved toward it, her breath catching in her throat. As she got closer, the glow resolved itself into something she couldn't quite make sense of, a cluster of lights, tiny and strange, hovering in the air. They shimmered, vibrating with a rhythm that matched the flickering of the town's streetlights. Lila felt her pulse quicken. These lights, they weren't reflections, weren't tricks of the eye. They were real, tangible, and yet utterly wrong. As she reached out a hand, hesitant, a voice stopped her. "You shouldn't have come." Lila spun around, her heart hammering. Rachel stood in the doorway, her face pale, eyes wide with something that looked too much like fear. She hadn't aged much since Lila had last seen her, but there was something different, an emptiness in her expression, a resignation that sent a chill down Lila's spine. "I got your message," Lila said, her voice shaky. "What's going on, Rachel? What is this?" Rachel stepped forward, her movements slow, deliberate. She didn't look at Lila, her gaze was fixed on the lights, the strange pulsating glow that seemed to have captured the very air of the room. "You remember when we used to come here," Rachel said, her voice distant, almost mechanical. "We thought it was just an old building. But it wasn't. This place, it's connected to the town. To whatever it is that makes people disappear." Lila's blood ran cold. "Disappear? You mean the flickering lights?" Rachel nodded. "Every time the lights flicker, something shifts. It's like the town is calling out, taking something from us. People, memories, pieces of ourselves. We thought it was just a coincidence, but the town, it's alive in a way we didn't understand, Lila shook her head, trying to make sense of it. But why us? Why now? Rachel turned to face her, and Lila saw the depth of her fear for the first time. Because we're part of it. We always have been. That's why you came back. You couldn't escape it, and neither could I. Lila took a step back, her heart racing. The lights pulsed brighter now, filling the room with their unnatural glow. The hum grew louder, vibrating through her bones. Rachel's voice dropped to a whisper. The town takes what it needs, Lila. And tonight, it needs us. Before Lila could react, the lights surged, blinding her with their intensity. She stumbled, covering her eyes as the room seemed to warp around her. The hum reached a deafening pitch, and for a moment, everything was swallowed by the light. When it faded, Lila was alone. The station was empty, the glow gone, the hum silenced. The only sound was the faint flicker of the streetlights outside, steady and unchanging. Lila stood frozen, her breath shallow. She looked around, her mind racing. Rachel was gone. The lights, the hum, the strange presence that had filled the air, all of it had vanished, leaving only silence in its wake. For a long time, Lila stood there, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But nothing did. Eventually, she turned and walked out of the station, the night pressing in around her. The streetlights flickered above, casting long shadows on the empty road. Pine Hollow looked just as it always had, quiet, still, ordinary. But Lila knew better. As she walked back through the town, the hum returned, faint but unmistakable, vibrating just beneath the surface of everything. She glanced at the houses, the familiar streets, the flickering lights overhead. The town was waiting, watching, and she knew, deep down, that it would never let her go.